We are still in Genesis, going to be in Genesis through the end of the month, and we'll finish everything up. What is the Bible character that we talked about last week? Or I guess who? Who's the Bible character we talked about last week?
Joseph.
You got it, Joseph, Kenny. We're talking about Joseph. He's the primary character for the rest of this quarter. He won't be the only character, but he is the primary character. And I mentioned last week that I love studying Joseph because he goes through so much adversity in his life, and to see how he responds to all the adversity that he deals with is great lessons for us.
That's right.
And we're going to see two of those today. We're going to see him go through some adversity, and he's going to be tempted. And how he handles that temptation is a great lesson for us. I'm going to bring up some things that I think we're going to see how Joseph handles it is some great things for us and how we can handle temptation. Because any of you not dealing with temptation anymore in life? We all deal with it, sometimes on a daily basis, sometimes even more often than that. Well, Joseph does some great things. It's a great example for us. And that, I think, is some of the things that our class, our lesson material goes through. But then I'm going to go on through the rest of chapter 37 and look at how Joseph handles adversity in his life. We're going to see how he's in two different situations, adverse situations in his life. We're going to see how similar they are, even though they're different. And we're going to see how does he handle himself in each of those situations. And both of them, he handles them almost identically. And it's a great lesson for us. How do we handle ourselves when we find ourselves maybe in some difficult situations? And so some lessons for us there as well. Well, last week, just as a recap, Joseph was 17 years old. He's hated by his brothers. Why did his brothers hate him?
Daddy's
Fathered by it.
You got it. You got it. He was Daddy's favorite, and it was exemplified by that coat of many colors, which it wasn't just a coat, but it's what the coat represented.
That's right.
The coat represented that he was not only the favorite son, but he had status above his brothers. He was not the one that was doing all the labor. He was more of in a supervisory role. And so his brothers hated him for the favoritism that their father gave them. And then he had some dreams that he shared. And it said his brothers hated him even more. And they hated him for his dreams. They hated him for his words. Whatever he said, they were not favorably disposed to that. And so they hated him a lot. His brothers went way up north to take care of their flocks. Joseph was given responsibility by his dad to check on his brothers. That part of his duties was checking up on others, apparently, as a supervisor. So he goes up to check on his brothers. He's by himself, apparently. His brothers are out there. His brothers take the opportunity and they say, here's our chance. We can get rid of our brother and all those dreams. And initially they talk about killing him. Premeditated murder. But then one of his brothers, Judah, speaks up and says, let's not kill him. We can make some money on this deal. We know there's traders going by. We can make 20 pieces of silver by selling him as a slave to the traders. And so that's exactly what they do. They sell him as a slave to the traders. And where we ended up last week, where was Joseph headed? Egypt, exactly right. Last verse in chapter 37, it said, meanwhile, the Midianites sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the bodyguard. And then today, we're going into chapter 39, and it starts off by saying, now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. It certainly seems like chapter 39 is starting right where chapter 37 left off, right? Except that there's a chapter in between. Chapter 38, and it's not part of today's lesson, but I hate skipping anything. So we're going to cover it real briefly. Would anybody like to read this for us?
Yikes.
Oh, sure.
Barry, this is
Come on.
comedy here.
This is an eye
Jerry
test.
wanted me to let him know if I was saying something humorous. We're not really going to read this. Instead, I'm going to summarize it for you by using our chart. Remember, I've had this chart up here a number of times of Jacob and his 12 sons through his 2 wives and his 2 wives' maids. But today we're going to, with that particular chapter, we want to focus on one son, and that is Judah.
Ugh.
That's who's involved in chapter 38. And to recap it real quick, Judah marries a Canaanite woman, which is something that the family in general did not want to do. His father didn't do that. His grandfather didn't do that. He marries a Canaanite woman. That's going to keep that in mind because that's going to fit in just a little bit here. Marries a Canaanite woman. We don't know her name, but they have 3 sons. Onan, and Shelah. Have 3 sons, and as the oldest one is of marrying age, Judah, because the culture in that day was the parents would pick out who they were going to marry. Judah picks out a local woman by the name of Tamar to marry their son. However, whatever the sin was, dies childless, and Tamar is childless, so there is no child at all. Dies, and the culture in those days, and we'll see this actually incorporated into the law later on, but the culture in those days was, if you died childless, dies childless, Tamar has no child, then the next son needs to go in and have sexual relations with his sister-in-law, and the child will be considered a child of the deceased husband. That way, that family heritage will continue. I know it sounds kind of crazy these days, but the idea was to continue the family heritage. And so that's exactly what happened. Judah said, okay, Onan, you need to do your responsibility and have a son, but it would not be your son. It would be considered the son and Tamar's son. Well, Onan doesn't want to do that. He spills his seed on the ground, the Bible tells us. God considers that bad, and Onan dies. Well, Shelah is too young for that at this point in time. He's not old enough to father a child, and so Judah tells Tamar, he says, okay, you're a widow. Go back home for now to your parents' home. Stay there as a widow, and when Shelah is old enough, then you can go ahead and I'll have Shelah carry his responsibility so that you can have a child, and it can be considered son. Well, as time goes along, Judah's wife dies, and so Judah is now a bachelor, and Shelah becomes old enough to father a child, but Tamar, living back with her parents, sees, well, Judah is not allowing me to have a child through Shelah. So she takes matters into her own hands. She knows that Judah travels back and forth from where he lives to take care of his flocks. And so she changes out of her widow's clothes and instead puts on clothes of a temple prostitute, which they had in those days. And so she knows the road that Judah takes. She positions herself along the road dressed up like a temple prostitute. Judah's traveling along there, and we kind of see a little bit of Judah's morals here, because Judah decides to have a one-night stand with this temple prostitute. He has no clue this is Tamar. He has no clue this is his daughter-in-law. All he knows is a temple prostitute. He's going to have a one-night stand. She says, fine, but you need to pay me. And he says, well, I'll pay you a goat. Where's the goat? Well, I don't have it here. It's with my flocks. She said, well, give me something so that I can try, collateral for the goat. And Judah says, okay, you can have my cord, my seal, and my staff. And those are special for me. You can have that as collateral, and then eventually I'll trade it back when I give you the goat. You can give it back to me. They have their one night stand. He goes on. The next day he has a buddy of his, and he says, that's going to be going that way. He says, can you take the goat and give it to the temple prostitute along the road there? In the meantime, Tamar has already left, gone back home, changed out of her clothes. She's dressed back as as a widow because your clothing designated who you were a lot more in those days, just like Joseph's coat of many colors designated his position. So she's back there, and Judah's friend brings the goat. No temple prostitute. He starts asking around. They said, there's no temple prostitute that normally positions herself along this street. So he goes back to Judah and says, I couldn't find anybody to get your stuff back. And Judah says, well, if we ask any more questions, we're going to become the laughing stock of the neighborhood. So I not out a goat, but I'm out my cord, my seal, and my staff. 3 months goes by, and all of a sudden Judah hears that Tamar is pregnant. And she was supposed to be saving herself for Shelah. And so Judah says, bring her out, and she's going to be burned. That was considered a capital offense. Well, they bring Tamar out, and Tamar says, time out, just for a minute here. The father of my child, my unborn child here, is the man who owns this cord, this seal, and this staff. Of course, Judah immediately recognizes it, that it's his. And so he says, wait a minute, she is not any more guilty than I am, which was a good admission on his part. I am just as guilty, in other words, as she is. And so the execution is called off. He never has relations with her again, but she ends up 6 months after that having not one but twins. She has twins, and those twins' names are Perez and Zerah. Now, we go back to the question I asked you at the end of class last week. Why in the world would this be included in this story, in here? Here we got the story of Joseph, and it's like Moses takes a time out and he shares a story about Judah and Tamar, and then continues on the story of Joseph. So why include it? Now, in your book, I think it does mention one reason, at least one reason, and that is it says, well, Judah's immoral behavior, particularly his immoral sexual behavior, is going to be in stark contrast with what we see about Joseph's moral behavior today. So certainly that's true. You can see a great contrast between how Judah handles sexual morality versus how Joseph handles sexual morality. But as I thought about it, I think there's at least two other possible reasons, and maybe all three are true, as to why this story is included. And the second reason goes back to our chart. Perez has a descendant, and I have dashes because it's not his son or his grandson or his great-grandson son, but down long in the line of Perez is a very important descendant of Perez. Anybody know who it is? I see Dawn shaking her head. Yes. Anybody else?
Jesus.
You got it.
That's right.
Shirley knows. Is that who you're going to say? You got it. I put down the word Messiah, but that's Jesus. Jesus is the descendant of Perez. So maybe, just maybe, part of this is included just to tell us a little bit why, how everything came about with the birth of Perez. So a second reason, the Messiah is the descendant of Judah and Tamar. But I thought of one more reason. Maybe I'll spell it out here first, then I'll tell you why. The story, I believe, shows that the family of Jacob was at this point in time in danger of being assimilated by the local Canaanite people. If you remember the story that Will told us a few weeks ago, very briefly, about Levi and Simeon killing all the males in Shechem, if you remember, the intent of the people of Shechem was, let's intermarry. And now we see Judah, he's doing that. He's intermarrying, and possibly some of other Judah's brothers maybe have been beginning to intermarry amongst the local Canaanite people. And if you remember, part of the Abrahamic covenant was God told Abraham, I will make you a great nation. Well, if they all intermarry, where's the nation? It's gonna be all assimilated in with the local people. And so I believe that had the events in Joseph's life not taken place, meaning he goes down to Egypt, and spoiler alert, he's eventually going to bring his whole family down to Egypt. if that hadn't taken place, that small group of Jewish people that were living in Canaan at the time, meaning Jacob and his family, might have been assimilated into the local population, and part of the Abrahamic covenant would have never been able to be fulfilled. So, growing up, I always thought of that story of Joseph as Joseph saved his family from starvation. Because remember, if you know the story, you know there's that famine, and so they all come down there and they're able to they provide food for them. But I think they're not only saved from starvation, they're saved from assimilation. So maybe a couple reasons why that's, well, 3 reasons I've given as to why that story is in there. Not part of our lesson, but I can't skip any part of Genesis. I love Genesis, and so we want to make sure we cover all of it. Any comments or questions about any of that before we continue on with our story of Joseph?
Just one quick comment, if there are no questions. Remember I told you, when it comes to morality, when it comes to doing things right or wrong, the Bible tells it like it is. So when you get to stories like Adam and Eve, when narratives like Noah and the Ark, which most of the world believes these are fairy tales, or at least, or at best rather, they're some kind of allegory or metaphor for something. No, these are historical accounts. And when you come to stories like this authenticates the fact that the Bible, particularly the book of Genesis that we're studying here, is a book of history, not a book of fairy tales. You see, if a Jewish author was making this up, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you wouldn't tell bad stories about them in their line. You wouldn't tell stories that denigrate the patriarchs. The Jewish author would leave that out if he were making it up. In court now today, they call that a statement against interest. If a witness says something that is against own, it adds to that witness's credibility. This adds to the credibility, the historicity of Genesis, so that you can believe the fantastic narrative of Noah, and you can believe the fantastic narrative of creation, because in the same book, these statements, these stories against the interest of the patriarchs, the Bible tells it like it is.
Excellent, excellent. All true. Well, that takes us back to, we're going to start in our lesson with chapter 39. We mentioned that it picks up right where chapter 37 ends up, except for that, I put a parenthesis because don't know exactly chronology-wise where that story about Judah and Tamar take place. But
great point.
For whatever reason, Moses put it in right there. God had Moses put it right there. I just want to mention again, because we're going to see this later on, pay attention to it. It says Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, as was his name, and notice who he is. He's an Egyptian. He's an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, and his particular function, his role, his title, is he is the captain of the bodyguard. So remember that, because we're going to bring that up in just a little while. And that's where Joseph ends up, and he purchases Joseph from the caravan of people that were coming down there. So continuing, Dawn, would you mind reading for us the next 3 verses?
The Lord was with Joseph, so he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Now his master saw that the Lord was with him, and how the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and became his personal servant. And he made him overseer over his house, and all that he owned he put in his charge.
Thank you. Okay, it tells us the Lord was with Joseph, and we're going to see the progression of what happens with Joseph here. Keep in mind, when he first arrived here, he may not have even spoken the language. They spoke a different language, which I think Will probably bring out next week, because that's going to be part of his lesson, but I'll steal a little part here.
Please.
They spoke a different language than Hebrew in Egypt, and so Joseph had to learn the language. He's probably starting at the very bottom. Potiphar doesn't know anything about Joseph when he buys him, so he starts as a slave, but from there he begins to progress, and he begins to work in the house. That would be a little more responsibility. And then from working in the house, he eventually gets to the point where he becomes Potiphar's personal servant. And if that is not enough, he then shows Potiphar that he can be trusted to become overseer over everything. So we see this progression. Did this happen in a couple weeks? No. It happened. It took years for this to happen. In a little bit, I'm going to show you my guesstimates of possibly how long this took and what age Joseph might have been to get up to this point to where now he's overseer over everything. But it mentions that the Lord was with Joseph, and I thought an interesting lesson here, because the Lord was with Joseph, but notice it says his master saw. His master saw that the Lord was with Joseph, and how the Lord caused everything he did to prosper. Now, Potiphar is an Egyptian. What does he know about Joseph's God? Probably not a lot, I'm guessing. In Egypt, they had plenty of gods.
That's right.
And so, he's an Egyptian by birth. So he doesn't know a lot, and yet he recognizes that there's something different about Joseph, at the very least. And I thought, what about us? When we have people that we come in contact with, we may work with, maybe even part of our family, maybe they're not believers. Do they see that the Lord is with us? Do they see that there's something different about us that is different than others? And hopefully it's a positive thing that's different about us. And they begin to take notice of that. It can be the difference in their eternal destiny, because maybe you never even share about God with them, but they begin to recognize that you're a Christian and you're different, and then somewhere along the line somebody else talks to them and say, I've seen that in other Christians. And so that can have an effect far beyond what you may even know. So think about your character, your witness to others. Is it something that makes you attractive, or is it something that is detractive? So I just thought a simple lesson right there in how we act around others who aren't believers. Any comments about that? Well, let's go on. Will, would you mind reading this next section for us?
Sure. It came about from that time he made him overseer in his house and over all that he owned. The Lord blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph. Thus the Lord's blessing was upon all that he owned, in the house and in the field. So he left everything he owned in Joseph's charge, and with him there he did not concern himself with anything except the food which he ate.
Thank you. I started reading this and I thought, this reminds me of something we've read earlier in Genesis. We talked about a month ago. Anybody recognize something similar to something earlier? I was thinking about Jacob when he was working for Laban, Joseph's father. We saw that when Jacob is working for Laban, that God blessed not just Jacob, but he blessed Laban as well. And so now here we have Joseph working as a slave, as a servant in Potiphar's house, and that blessing is coming upon Potiphar. And I thought about the Abrahamic covenant. Remember, I will bless those who bless you. And so as Potiphar is, in a sense, blessing Joseph by giving him more responsibility, that blessing is in turn coming back upon Potiphar. So we're seeing a little bit of that Abrahamic covenant already being fulfilled 100 years later, 150 years later. So we have that there. And he's all the way to a point now where there's only one thing that Potiphar even concerns himself with: the food that he ate. That's a lot of trust. That's a lot of respect. That's a lot of responsibility.
That's right.
On Joseph's part. It says about from this time. And so I thought, okay, what time are we talking about here? And the Bible doesn't specifically say so, but I love working with numbers in the Bible. And so I put together a little timeline. The black numbers are things that the Bible tells us for sure. The red is going to be my guess. But we know that Joseph was 17 in the beginning of chapter 37. We know that Joseph, when he stands before Pharaoh, he is now 30 years old. And we know that 2 years before that, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, which I'll mention at the end of the later on today, but Will's definitely going to talk about next week. Joseph interprets their dreams when he's 28 years old. So in between that are going to be some guesses on my part. I figured for Joseph to learn the language, to work his way up to eventually becoming the overseer over Potiphar, minimum of 5 years, maybe even more. He was at least 22, could have been 23, 24, 25, somewhere along in that time frame. And keep in mind that age of Joseph, because that's going to fit in with what we're going to see in just a minute. But he's going to be in that age frame, and then eventually he's falsely accused, so maybe about 25 by that point in time. And then I'm going to mention in a minute about a chief cupbearer, a chief baker, and Joseph interprets their dream. Oh, they first get thrown into jail. Boy, I'm mixing the story all in here. I'm putting things ahead of time, but it'll all fit in. They're in jail maybe a year before he interprets their dream, or about a year. So when it says about that time, you can kind of see time frame of Joseph's life, where this is all fitting in here. You with me?
So just to be clear, that phrase about that time on your timeline, point to that and show them where they are in the approximate timeline.
We're talking about somewhere around here, somewhere
Yep.
where I would think between 22 and 25 years old. Joseph is going to be between 22 and 25 years old when this next set of verses occur.
And that's important.
Yeah, that is going to fit in here. In fact, would you mind reading this for us?
Okay, Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. It came about after these events that his master's wife lifted up her eyes with desire at Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me."
Okay, now the temptation is beginning. Keep in mind what we just said about Joseph's age. He's, what, between 22 and 25, we said.
Mm-hmm.
Somewhere in that age. He is a man that is, well, as it says, handsome in form and appearance. At that age, that's about the most handsome you're going to be, right? Sorry to say, as we get older, maybe we get a little less handsome. I don't know. Hopefully not to our wives, but and also think about Joseph. Testosterone is going to be at his highest level at that age, which is going to make these kind of statements from Mrs. Potiphar very attractive to a guy who's 25 years old. Very attractive. So is Joseph dealing with temptation at this point in time?
You bet.
You betcha.
Yeah.
Oops, I didn't want to show that yet. I wanted to first talk a little bit about Mrs. Potiphar. Why is Mrs. Potiphar going after Joseph in this particular situation? And I think there could possibly be a number of reasons why. Number one is how Joseph appears to her. You know, she's attracted to him. Think about her husband, Mr. Potiphar. To get to the position where he's at, where he's a captain of the bodyguard, is he going to be in his 20s? No, he's going to be much older before he ever gets to a position like that. So he's much older, and so maybe that's a reason why Joseph is attractive to her. Also, you think about a guy like the captain of the bodyguard, he may not have chosen his wife. That may have been a political choosing. We're going to see that, I think, in coming weeks, that Joseph doesn't choose his wife. When he stands before Pharaoh, Pharaoh chooses who his wife is going to be.
Excellent.
And so just as Joseph doesn't choose his wife, maybe Potiphar didn't choose his wife either, and so maybe there's never been any love between them.
Excellent.
One other little thing you wouldn't know in English, but I love to look up some of these words in Hebrew. I don't know Hebrew, but I love to use my concordance. And the word officer, I looked up that word officer in Hebrew. It's the word saris, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Mark's not here to correct me, so that means I'm right. It occurs 42 times in the Old Testament, but about a third of those times it is not translated officer, is instead translated eunuch. So now, we don't know if Potiphar is a eunuch or not, but it opens up the possibility that he could be, which means there wouldn't be any sexual relations between the two of them, which is just one more possible added reason to why Mrs. Potiphar is looking now at Joseph and trying to tempt Joseph. Let me pass that on.
Oh, right.
Pass that on to them. And we'll pray that they're feeling all right. Because we missed her. What is her name again?
Gladys.
We missed Gladys for a few weeks.
Yeah, that was her therapist.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm glad they were here when they could be
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
So anyway, I just mentioned that to say Joseph now is dealing with temptations, and she's tempted as well. Maybe that's a number of reasons why she's being tempted. Well, let's go on, because now we're going to begin to look at Joseph's response to this temptation. Will, you want to
Sure.
read this for us?
But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he has put all that he owns in my charge. There is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God?"
Thank you. Okay, we're dealing now with the subject of temptations. Temptations is where we're faced with something, and we have a choice to make, right? Do we go the way of the temptation, which is following against towards the devil, or do we resist the temptation and take a path towards God? I have a picture to show you, because this came into a real picture for me 2 years ago. 2 years ago, I was in Southern California for the summer months because my son and daughter-in-law just had their second child, and so we stayed with them to help them out. And one of my responsibilities every day was to take my oldest granddaughter, who at the time was not quite 3, to a Christian preschool that she attended. And so every day on my way home from dropping her off at the Christian daycare or Christian preschool, I came to an intersection, and one day I stopped and I said, I got to get out of my car and take a picture of this sign. And this was the sign, and don't worry if you can't read it, because I'm going to enlarge it. I enlarged it. Now, is anybody here, it's in Spanish, because in Southern California, a lot of this neighborhoods and streets are in Spanish. Does anybody know, it says Avenida del Diablo on the left side. Anybody know what that means?
Avenue of
Avenue
Satan.
of the devil.
You got it, Avenue of the Devil. I know just enough Spanish to know that's what it said. And then the sign on the right, the other road, says Del Dios Road.
Yes.
What does that mean in English?
God.
The way of God.
You got it, the road of God, or the way of God. I thought, wow, what a perfect illustration. Every day I come to this intersection and I have to make a choice. Do I go the way of the devil, or do I go the way of God? Fortunately, every day I was turning right. So I was going the way of God, and my son's house was just off of that road. But I thought, what a perfect illustration. We come across things like this every day, but it's not always plain and clear signs like this.
That's right.
Sometimes it looks very attractive to go the way of the devil, which is what it was for Joseph here. It was very attractive for him to go that way. Which way does he choose? And so Joseph gives rather a long explanation to Mrs. Potiphar, but in the end he says, how can I do this great evil and sin against God? And I'm thinking to myself, sin against God, I could see you saying sinning against Potiphar or sinning against Mrs. Potiphar, but why does he consider this sinning against God? Anybody have a thought on that? He's away from home. Is God even in the picture? God's there, right?
Absolutely.
It's not just with his family back in Canaan.
That's right.
God's there, and so even though he doesn't have the Bible like we do, he still knows that God has some moral standards to follow. And so at the very least, he understands, if I have relations with Mrs. Potiphar, I'm stealing against Mr. Potiphar. I'm stealing a relationship that he has with her. I am violating Mrs. Potiphar. And so he understands at least some level of a moral standard that he understands that God has. And so he makes that statement, how then could I do this great evil and sin against God? So even those who don't have the scripture, God's written morality on our hearts, which it mentions in the book of Romans. So I put the statement here, what do we do when sexual temptations come? And then I thought, wait a minute, I need to scratch off that word sexual, because this applies for any temptations. Any temptations, I saw three things that I saw Joseph does here, and they are three things that we can do when any kind of temptation comes our way. If we follow what Joseph does, it'll help to protect us against those temptations. The first one is what he says right here. And I said, remember that nothing is hidden from God. For me, this has been a great help for me in temptations. I grew up going to church. I knew the Bible stories. I knew about God. I knew that he sees everything, that he knows everything. And yet, moving it from here down to here is something that took me time. It wasn't until I was a young adult where I began to really realize, yeah, God really does see everything. And so he sees when I make the wrong choices, and he's going to hold me account. He's a God of justice. He's going to hold me account. And so I need to remember that when I come and have a choice to make. Not only does he see that, I thought about first of all when he sees that. So when nobody else is around and I want to take something, God still knows. When I'm at my computer or I'm watching TV and I can watch something that is not appropriate, God still sees it, even if nobody else is around. Whenever anything comes along my way, if nobody else is there, God still sees it. He's a God of justice. He's going to hold me to account. I even then realized that affects my thought life. My thought life as well, because God knows my thoughts. And if nothing else, we know that from the New Testament, because Jesus is God. And there were numerous times when it tells us that Jesus knew what people were thinking.
That's right.
So God knows what we're thinking. So even thoughts, and to me that's even more important, because wrong thoughts come in all of our minds. There's no way we can stop a wrong thought from entering our mind. So the question is, what do we do with it?
Yes.
Do we block it out right away, or do we begin to entertain that thought and give it some time and give it some thought? It reminded me of something the church that I used to attend. Our pastor said, and I don't know if this came from him or came from somebody else, but I've never forgotten what he shared. He said, sow a thought, reap a deed. Sow a deed, reap a habit. Sow a habit, reap a character. Sow a character, reap a destiny. Well, we all want to have good destinies, right? But a good destiny comes from having good character. Good character comes from developing good habits. Good habits coming from having the right kinds of deeds. And good deeds come from our thought life. You got it. Comes from our thought life. And so when we think about being tempted, whatever that temptation may be, those temptations first enter our mind. What do we do with them? There's another quote. I was going to show it, but for sake of time I won't. Martin Luther, the reformer, said, you can't stop the birds from flying over your head. And the birds were a symbol of temptations, thoughts. He said, you can't stop a bird from flying over your head, but you can certainly stop it from making a nest in your hair. And I thought, what a great thing, because we can't stop bad thoughts from coming in our mind, but we can stop them from staying there a while
That's right.
and beginning to entertain them. And boy, that's made a difference in my life. It's just remembering that, because I, like everybody else, have wrong thoughts that enter my mind. And so knowing that God knows my thoughts has protected me in that regards. So remember, first of all, that nothing is hidden from God. Then we go on to the second part, which I found two more things that Joseph did that I think help us in the area of temptation. Would you mind reading that for
Okay.
us?
And she spoke to Joseph day after day, and he did not listen to her, to lie beside her, or even be with her. Now it happened one day that he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the household were there inside. She caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." And he left his garment in her hand and fled and went outside.
Excellent. So we've got our first one here, but notice it says that he tried not to even be with her. And it also mentions that he was trying not to be there if he would be there alone. If there's other men around, then that's going to help with that issue of temptation. And so I see the second thing that Joseph did to guard himself when temptation arises is to avoid those situations where we might be tempted.
That's right.
If you are dealing with the temptation of alcohol, don't hang out with your friends at the bar. If you have a temptation of gossiping about someone else, and you know there's a friend that you have that is a gossip, you may have to avoid hanging out with that person very often, because that's just going to feed that to you, and you'll be more susceptible to that temptation. Per people, places, events, if you find yourself being most tempted in those circumstances, and you know your own life, you know where you're mostly to be tempted, avoid them. If looking at the wrong things on a computer are a temptation for you, position your screen in such a way that other people can see it, so that you can avoid being alone, like Joseph tried to avoid being alone in that house. Unfortunately, he couldn't avoid it 100% of the time. And so as a result, the third situation comes along here. And so the third one is when all else fails, he had to flee. And so when all else fails and temptation grabs us by the proverbial shirt, don't linger, but flee.
That's right.
So I thought, three good examples from Joseph in this situation, but it's more than just sexual temptations. It can apply to almost any temptation we have. Three good examples of temptation. Well, I'm not going to go through all this chapter for this. Well, we'll just see how it goes here. When she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, she then makes up an accusation against him, a false accusation. She says, "See, he brought this Hebrew man to us to make sport of us. He came into me, lying with me. I screamed. When he heard that I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me and fled and went outside." Well, you know, we just read it. That's not what happened at all. She's making it up, false accusation, but then she leaves the garment beside herself and waits for Mr. Potiphar to come home. When he comes home in verse 17, she spoke to him these words, "The Hebrew slave whom you brought to us." I thought that's interesting. She says, "Whom you brought to us." It's almost like she's blaming her husband. This is all because of what you did. Reminded me of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden.
That's right.
When God came to Adam and said, "Why did you do what I told you not to do?" And what did Adam say? "That woman you gave to me, she caused me." But we love to blame somebody else.
That's right.
And then, of course, Eve did the same thing. It was the serpent's fault. So I just thought, things haven't changed. And it's still that way now. When we get caught, we usually blame someone else first. So human nature is the same. And so that's actually a good thing, because we can learn from human nature as well. Well, she says, "He came in and made sport of me. I raised my voice, screamed. He left his garment beside me and fled outside." And the master hears what she says, And what his wife spoke to him, saying, "This is what your slave did to me," his anger burned. So Joseph's master took him and put him into the jail, the place where the king's prisoners were kept confined, and he was there in the jail. So he goes from being a high-ranking slave to now going into a jail. And it's not a normal jail. This is the jail where the king's prisoners were kept, which means it's probably a political prison. Maybe a little bit better circumstances for the prisoners, but nonetheless, prison, and who knows when you're going to get out. I want to focus on this phrase, is anger burned. Why did his anger burn?
Great question.
Well, he trusted Joseph with everything.
You got it. And so now Joseph is being accused of this crime, and his anger is burning. However, as I've thought about this,
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that is why his anger burned. As a kid growing up, I knew this story well. I'm thinking, yeah, his anger burned against Joseph. But now I'm thinking, maybe, and I'm going to show you some evidence, maybe his anger burned not at Joseph, but his anger burned at Mrs. Potiphar and the position that she has put him in.
Yes.
And I'll show you several reasons. The first reason is right here. Where was Joseph placed?
In a nice jail.
You got it. For a slave being caught in what he's being accused of doing, that was a capital offense. The fact that Joseph is alive is one piece of evidence that Mr. Potiphar maybe does not believe his wife. But I'm going to show you something else here. This is a verse in the next chapter. And this has to do with the story of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker doing something to offend Pharaoh. And it says that, this is Pharaoh, so Pharaoh put them, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, in confinement in the house of the captain of the bodyguard, in the jail, the same place where Joseph was in prison. So now the chief cupbearer, the chief baker are in the same prison with Joseph. But what took years to catch my attention is this phrase right here. Where is this jail located?
Is in the house
At
of the captain of the
Potiphar's
bodyguard.
The house of the captain of the bodyguard. And who's the captain of the bodyguard? We go back to chapter 38. Potiphar is the captain of the bodyguard. Now you have to understand what a house is like in Bible days. Old Testament, even in New Testament, house is different than what we think house. And this is helping to put things in context. Nowadays, a house, well, we think we have this piece of property, quarter acre, half acre, multiple acres. We have a driveway that goes there. We have a front yard. We have a backyard, side yards. We have a garage. And then we have what we call a house. And that's where we've got a door and windows and a roof. A house meant something different in Bible days. Typically, you had a walled off area, and in that walled off area you had a compound, and because of the climate, part of that outdoor compound was your living area. You had your kitchen out there, you probably ate out there most of the time, and then that's where the kids played, so you could call that your family room too. You also had some rooms that maybe had doors and windows on them and a roof, and that might be where you sleep at night if it's cool. That would be where you keep some of your grain, some of your other possessions. But all of that together, that entire walled compound, is referred to as the house. Now also, historians tell us, both Old and New Testament, in Bible days, when you had a prison, you had a jail, that was usually attached to the jailer's home. So here, Potiphar being the captain of the bodyguard, it would make sense. He's the individual who would be responsible for taking care of the political prisoners because he has a political position. And so the jail is attached to his house. And so when Potiphar has to remove him from the living quarters of his house, he simply moves him to the jail quarters of his house.
Yes.
And Joseph never totally leaves, which is good for Potiphar because, well, it's good and bad. Potiphar no longer has Joseph taking care of his affairs in the living portion of his house. However, he knows that he's been blessed by having Joseph there. And so Joseph hasn't totally left his house. So to me, that's another reason why that occurs. And then in this chapter 40, one more thing that occurs right after that is we see that Potiphar is still involved in Joseph's life. Because when the chief cupbearer and the chief baker get placed into this political prison, who is it that puts Joseph in charge? The very next verse. The captain of the bodyguard, i.e. Potiphar, puts Joseph in charge of them. Why? Because Potiphar trusts Joseph. Joseph has proven himself. He trusts Joseph, which means he probably does not trust the accusation that's been against him.
Well done.
So I thought, I didn't know this as a kid growing up, but somebody started to point this out to me, and then I began to put it together and realize the evidence is all there, that Joseph is still trusted. Well, you know, we're about out of time. I was going to talk about what happens. Well, I'll tell you, we'll look at it real quickly here. I'll just read it. This is just the rest of the chapter. The Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. Unnamed, the chief jailer committed to Joseph's charge all the prisoners who were in jail so that whatever was done there, he was responsible for it. The chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made to prosper. And I got to think, this is deja vu all over again. Just what happened to Joseph over the years in Potiphar's house, in the living part of his house, is now happening to Joseph in the prison part of the house. And I'll show you how Joseph handles both situations, neither one which he wanted, but as he was placed in these situations, how Joseph handles them both the same way. So if you stick with me, 5 quick things that we see Joseph does. First thing is, he relies on the Lord. In both places it says that the Lord was with Joseph. Second thing is, we see as a result the Lord gives him favor. And in both passages, and the first verses are when Joseph's in the living quarters of Potiphar's house. The second is when he's in the jail portion of Potiphar's house. It says the Lord gave him favor. Thirdly, we see when Joseph came into this bad situation, did he just cross his arms and say, no way am I doing anything here? No, we know he worked. In the first one we saw that he's doing things. He's working. And the second one, once again, he's doing things. He's not sitting and pouting. He's working regardless of the situation. Fourth, there's evidence of his responsibility. He is a very responsible individual. Potiphar puts him in charge of everything that he owned. The jailer does the same thing, puts him in charge of all of the prisoners. And lastly, Joseph shows that he's trustworthy. Potiphar did not concern himself with anything because he trusted Joseph. The jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge. Why? He trusted Joseph. So a real quick lesson here, the second part of the chapter. How did Joseph become successful at both jobs? Neither job which he wanted. He relied on the Lord gave him favor, he worked, he was responsible, and he was trustworthy. I'll give you one word for that. Joseph had integrity. Joseph had integrity regardless of the situation. Same with us. Whatever situation we may find ourselves in today. Most of us are retired, whether we work, whether we volunteer, whatever group we may be in, whether we want to be there or not, do we exhibit integrity? Do we exhibit integrity? And I thought, well, this really fits in with the whole lesson. We've talked about temptation. How do we deal with that? I think integrity is a part of that. To end up the chapter, Joseph's still in prison. He's a political prisoner with no help of leaving, at least not standing up. Of course, you know the rest of the story, and will tell us that next week. But I thought Joseph, regardless, he knew to do the right thing and to trust God for the results. He trusted God's sovereignty. He didn't know what those results were going to be. As far as he knew, he was stuck. But his responsibility was to do the right thing. God's responsible for the results. And so, thanks for the last 5 minutes. We can cover that. Next week, even Nancy, though you don't have a book, you can, next week's lesson's in chapter 41, but if, I know Will's enough like me that he's not going to skip chapter 40. So,
Can't do it.
read chapter 40, read chapter 41. You'll be prepared for next week. And we're going to continue learning some great lessons from Joseph.
All right, stand right up there and
Okay.
just move over here into the center.
Okay?
If you have ever heard, read, watched a movie about Joseph, then you know what you know. But today, you got a taste of not only what the Bible says, but how an excellent Bible expositor can take all of the evidences from wherever they are in Scripture and bring them together to create a fuller picture of how things occurred. That is an example of some of the most outstanding, what we call exegesis, pulling from the Bible. Not making stuff up, but pulling from the Bible that which is already there in different parts of Scripture, different parts of several chapters, to create a full picture of this narrative of Joseph's temptations, right? Both in Potiphar's house and in the jail. You won't see that in most sermons because there's not time to do that. And you won't see it in many, many Bible classes because they just don't
Dig in.
come as good as
dig in.
this instructor is. So I want to personally thank you,
Thank
for,
you. Thank
for
you.
what you've done today.
I can't spell
Just
exegesis, but I can do it, I guess.
So thank you for that. Any final questions? Okay.